If you're in one career and are thinking about transitioning to writing full-time, how do you do that? Our guest today had a fascinating career as an award-winning journalist, essayist, and professor, who's also now a book author writing about mountain-moving faith by day and scintillating mystery by night. You won't want to miss today's edition of The Inside Story.
Welcome to another episode of The Inside Story, exclusively on Liftable.tv. They say everyone has a book in them, but turning that desire into a compelling story can seem overwhelming. That's where The Inside Story comes in. Your host, Walt Larimore, is himself an author of over 40 books. Walt's goal in every episode is to inspire and entertain you by spending quality time with best-selling authors and having conversations about the art and the heart of writing. In this episode, you'll be encouraged and equipped to lean into your own writing dream and pick up some insider tips and tricks of the trade. Grab a cup of coffee and get ready for The Inside Story on Liftable.tv.
Hi, I'm Walt Larimore, and I'm so glad you're joining me in my home library for The Inside Story. Our guest today is an award-winning journalist, an author, an essayist, and a novelist who writes stories of faith and mystery. Her personal essays have been published in the New York Times Magazine, Newsweek, USA Today, USA Weekend, Chicago Tribune, the Denver Post, Rocky Mountain News, the Charles Stanley Ministries In Touch magazine, and featured on National Public Radio's Weekend Edition. And not only that, but her essays have also been reprinted in more than a dozen college textbooks on composition and writing. A retired associate professor of journalism at the University of Colorado at Boulder, our guest is now a regular contributor to our Daily Bread Ministries and Dayspring's online Encourage community. Her debut novel, A 1920s Mystery, All That Is Secret, was just released by Tyndale House. She and her husband Dan are longtime residents of Colorado and have 2 grown children and 5 grandchildren. The Inside Story is delighted to welcome Patricia Raybon. Patricia, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
It's the first time we've met.
And somebody told me that you're a harmless guy.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
so I feel very safe with you today.
I wonder if my kids would agree. After we were moving, our kids were 6 and 7. We were leaving North Carolina. And the mover took the sofa to the moving van. He came back in. He had 3 wooden spoons. And he said, "We found these in the sofa." So maybe our son wouldn't say that I was so harmless. But let's go back to your beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I grew up on a church pew. I know geographically I should say I grew up in Colorado because I did. But when I think about it, Walt, I grew up in a little Sunday school room with a felt board on the wall, listening to a teacher talk about the battles and the heroes of the Old Testament and the miracles of Jesus and the acts of the apostles in the New Testament. And what I learned at that little table in that little Sunday school room in Denver, Colorado, is that the Bible is a story with hundreds of little stories in it, and that stories change lives. That's a pretty sophisticated concept for a child. I would not have been able to articulate it that way then, but looking back on it, I understand that that beginning that placed me right in the heart of story changed my life. I wouldn't be here talking to you today if I had not had that beginning.
I'm old enough that I know what you meant when you said felt board, but we've got viewers I don't think will have a clue about that. I was overcome with emotion hearing you say that because I had a similar experience. But let's clue people in who don't know what a felt board is and why it's so powerful for storytelling.
It's a visual depiction of the characters and the situations, cut out figures, perfectly sized for little children's hands, and perfectly shown, visualized, so that a small child can understand what's happening in this case, in the Bible.
So it might be a board of felt, and then there'd be a little Jonah, and we'd stick little Jonah on, and then we'd have the whale, irrespective that the scripture maybe didn't say whale. But anyway, and then the whale would move over, but it just brought it to life, didn't it?
Psychologists would probably say that there was probably something tactile, something that happened in that tactile process of cutting out the figures, placing them on the felt, hearing the story, and then getting the graham crackers and milk. It was a win-win situation all the way.
Your mom and dad?
My dad came to Colorado to work for the Air Force Finance and Accounting Center, one of two black men at that facility at that time with an accounting background. My mother was a phys ed teacher and a take no prisoners. Did you ever have a phys ed teacher who was a take no prisoners?
I can imagine. I had coaches like that.
Right. They're cut out, speaking of felt, they're cut out of the same cloth. And those were my parents.
And did your mom's take no prisoners approach influence her parenting?
What influenced their parenting is that they did it together. And even today, my parents have passed away, but my sister and I still refer to them as Mom and Daddy. They were one. And there was no separation in how they decided things, how they ruled and lived and made decisions about us. So there was no going around to get to the other.
So you had the influence of finance, the influence of physical education. You chose a career in journalism. Makes perfect sense. How did that happen?
I needed to make a living. And I had been encouraged by a third grade teacher in Denver who called me up to her desk one day and asked me if I would like to be a writer when I grew up.
Really?
Yes.
Third grade.
And I was stunned, just as I am right now, by the question, but I knew I loved reading and writing, and I said, yes, I'd love to be a writer. She said, Patricia, you are a writer. When I think about that moment and how she declared that over me, I don't know, Walt, if she even knew the profundity of that moment for her and for me. She was saying, I see something in you skill-wise, but she also was saying, I see that you have something to say. That's a lot for a third grader to, I couldn't process it then.
Wow. But it planted that seed.
It did.
Is she still alive? Have you been able to tell her? Was it a woman?
Yes, was. And when I had my very first book signing 25 years ago, she had retired at that point, but she was my special guest at the Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver, and I was able to tell that story.
Wow.
So I have always been grateful for that, and grateful for my parents who never said, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. But the thing that made such a difference for me is that she told me it was okay to dream. And my parents did not squash that dream. And but I needed to earn a living, to answer your question. So journalism was the one way that I knew to make a living as a writer.
I have the privilege of getting to meet teachers and in my day job. And so I will tell them, I think mostly because of Barb's mom and dad were educators, and I got to see the inside. But I'll tell them, I want you to know that I consider what you do not just a job, but a ministry, because of the impact that you have that can be eternal.
Right.
And that's what happened in your case.
That's what happened.
Wow. And then off you go to, it pains me as an LSU fan to say, some small university in Ohio that you went to, Ohio something. actually the Ohio State University for a degree in journalism, and then back to the University of Colorado at Boulder. Why the 2 degrees? Were they complementary or?
Graduate school for me provided context, and I'm sure there's a way to gain context just by being a heavy reader and a thinker and somebody who does a lot of reflection. But graduate school invited me to think about the story behind the story. And even to understand journalism is more than just a business about free press, but one that helps communities build by sharing information that people then have to wrestle over and argue about, which people do. And in that process, figure out how to be community.
But you didn't just become a teacher or professor. I mean, you had, a dozen years as a newspaper journalist. Would I call it a beat journalist? But Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News. Before you joined the faculty, how did that inform your career of deadlines and story and being concise?
Well, I love talking about that because after working on the news desk for a couple of years, one day on the bulletin board in the newsroom was an announcement that there was a position open in the features department. And I have this idea that I share that little hinges open big doors. I could have walked away from that announcement, but I answered it. I was given the position and literally moved upstairs to the features department. And the trajectory of my career turned and changed everything. Because I went from writing about facts to writing about feelings. In fact, I was encouraged to do that kind of writing, to look at the places in people's lives and struggles and triumphs and problems and find out how they feel about it and what they're doing about those feelings. The other thing that happened at that time, Walt, is that in journalism, there was a trend for something called long-form journalism. And so we went from writing, 500 to 800 word feature story to these long Sunday page one features, 1,500, 2,500, 3,000 word.
I mean, what a gift for you.
It was a gift.
Was it a hard transition?
No, it was like a gift. Here's a place where you can really stretch out as a writer. So one of my first stories was covering migrant worker families. This predated the migrant worker movement. Living out east of Denver, and one family, this family was living in a revised chicken coop in horrific conditions. And I remember thinking, this is just a few minutes from Aurora. And so these long stories allowed us to go out and meet people and really spend time learning about their lives and their stories and sharing who they were. Soon after that, the Big Thompson River flooded up in the mountains in Colorado. And I was assigned to go up and talk to families who were trying to recover from that. And
a huge flash flood with
yes.
many deaths and buildings destroyed.
Right. And so I eventually learned that this long-form format allowed us to help people process what they had experienced. And I'm not a psychologist. I have a sister who's a licensed clinical psychologist, in fact. But it was a ministry that we were doing. I didn't understand it that way, but we were giving people an opportunity to talk about what had happened to them. And there was room in those long stories for them to really, for us to honor what they had to say about it.
But I imagine it was more than that in the sense, correct me if this is wrong, but not just honoring them and not just their story, but then how to tell that story in a way that's captivating and persuasive.
Yes.
Would that be correct?
Right. because information is not writing. Information, that's just facts on a page. So the format was demanding of the writer to learn a richer, deeper way to tell story.
I've encountered many authors who began in journalism. We all know best-selling authors that began that way, others that began in creative writing. Yours, of course, was journalism. If you had to speak to one versus the other, to a young writer that's thinking they want to get some training, what would be the advantage and disadvantage of each?
Well, not everybody can go to journalism school, but one thing the answer, I'll say it this way. The answer to the question is in the word journalism. And if you know French, you see the word jour, which means day. And that describes journalism. Every day you are writing stories. Every day you're on deadline. Every day you're in the writing, thinking about the writing, getting edited. You become the guardian of the language. And there's an honoring that, even though the profession isn't necessarily always respected, there is an honoring in newspaper journalism, I can speak to that really speaks to the power of the word. And when you're doing it every day, day after day, it's just great training for book writing.
Besides just the feature writing you did, you got into essay writing and became quite successful at that. How'd that transition take place?
It started because of a practical demand. Have you ever heard the phrase, publish or perish?
Well, not in medicine, of course. I mean, I guess there's a lot of academic disciplines where that you either publish, to explain to our viewers, or you can lose your job or not advance or not move.
Right.
Would that be the...
Well, at that point, I had transitioned from newspaper journalism, and I was teaching journalism at the University of Colorado at Boulder on the tenure track. In order to be awarded tenure, I had to publish. And so I began to write first-person think pieces about faith and race. Even then, even though I was teaching news reporting, when it came time to getting published, I turned to personal essays. But something else, I was thinking about this last night, Walt. When I sent them out, I sent them strategically to outlets that would matter to a tenure committee. So I would send them to the New York Times Sunday Magazine or Newsweek or USA Today or USA Weekend, so that I was showing that I could get published in a national venue. And so there was a strategy to that. And for people who are thinking about watching this and thinking about their own career, I would encourage that too. Do the writing, but then strategically think about where you are sending it. Wow. Because I'm moving ahead, but that's how I found my first agent. You know, when I would get an essay published in a national venue, the mail, this is before email, I would get letters saying, if you ever want to publish a book, I'd like to represent you. And so by doing...
planting another seed, I guess, right? I mean...
Right. And I remember my husband saying, I think you better write a book.
Had you not thought about that at that point? Or
I would dream about it. I'd walk into bookstores and wonder, how does this happen? How do these books get here? Because I didn't really know the process. And but by being faithful to the writing, and if there's a takeaway for this episode today, that's really one I want to stress. By giving time and attention to the writing itself, there were rewards to that.
Learning the craft.
And then releasing the gift. Because I am guessing there are dresser drawers all over the world filled with manuscripts that have never been sent out. You don't know until you send it to somebody.
Or stories that have never been told. And I want to come back to that because you you said you had a dream, a long time dream, planted in the 3rd grade. Then boom, you write an essay. Some people write you and say, we're interested. What side railed that process? What was there? Self-talk saying I can't do it? Was there fear of rejection? What kept you from it? And then what finally brought you to the point of saying, I am going to find an agent. I am going to write that book I've been dreaming about.
Well, when I was getting all those invitations saying, may I represent you, one of those people was a friend of the woman who became my editor eventually for my first book, at Viking Penguin. And so we had a long phone conversation about what would this first book be about. Here I am in the School of Journalism, but I'm writing about faith and race. And that first book, in fact, turned out to be a book about racial forgiveness. And so I can tell you this story. Nobody's listening to this.
Okay, just
you and me. Okay. My dean, who I hope isn't watching this, said, that's not going to cut it for tenure. We need you to write an academic book. But my heart said, this is your story to tell. Wow. This is a book about racial forgiveness. You need to tell it. People need to read it. And so I wrote a first draft of a synopsis. My agent said, do you have that book called How to Write a Book Proposal? And I said, yes. She said, throw it away. Sit down from the heart and write what you need to say. And I cried tears writing that prologue, that synopsis that became the prologue to the book.
Tears of joy, tears of fear, tears of sorrow.
All of the above. I was doing it. I was terrified. And, my job was on the line, number one. And I was into that area that's so hard for us to talk about. And I knew that if I didn't go there, there wouldn't be a book. And I would say to people who are watching our program that when the writing gets scary and hard, you're probably in the right place.
Do you think that's true of calling in general? I'm getting off subject, but it seems like it would be, wouldn't it? Right. That if it's God's call and God's vision, it's got to be bigger than us. And that gets scary. We can't depend on we have to depend upon He.
Right.
Do we do it or do we not?
Yes. If it's something that we can do ourselves, probably it's not from Him.
So to fast forward, we have racial conciliation, then we have devotionals that we do, and then we have faith books, and then we have mystery. So that's a course. How did that happen?
When I decided during the pandemic summer to complete a mystery that I had started several years ago, I thought I had hit that the proverbial fork in the road, and that it wouldn't make sense for me to be on these two paths. And then I figured out it's the same road. There is no faith without mystery. What King Nebuchadnezzar said to Daniel, your God is a God of gods, the Lord of kings, and understands all mysteries. And of course, we know all the amazing things that the Apostle Paul said about mysteries. And so I began to appreciate that when I write about mystery, I'm writing about faith. When I write about faith, I'm writing about mystery.
Is it kind of like two sides of the same coin, would you say?
That's a good way to describe it.
Some quick questions as we approach the end of our time together. What's your favorite word?
Hope.
Your least favorite word?
Retired.
Your favorite verse in the Bible?
I'm not ashamed of the gospel.
Because in it is the power of Christ. Your favorite spiritual discipline?
Prayer.
And your least favorite spiritual discipline?
I think it's fasting, but when I do fast, there's so much that comes from it. But when I think about it, it always feels like the least favorite.
What profession other than being a writer or being a journalist or being a professor or being an essayist, what profession other than the ones you've done would you most like to attempt?
None of the above. What I do is what I understand, and I stay in my lane. I don't even think about what might have been doing something else.
Of all the possible professions you could have chosen, what would be the one you'd least like to be involved in?
I can't even put a name on it, Walt.
When you
And the other thing is I don't want to disparage somebody else's beloved career, so I'll stay out of it. That's a diplomatic answer.
I understand. When you enter heaven's pearly gates, other than well done, my good and faithful servant, which I think you will hear, what would you like to hear the Lord say?
Come and eat.
A mystery yet to happen. Patricia Raybon, thank you for being here. You honor us being here today.
Thank you.
Well, before we end today's program, if you have a comment or suggestion or an author you'd like me to interview, just email me at insidestory@liftable.tv. And in addition, if you'd like to subscribe to one of my blogs or newsletter, just sign up at drwalt.com. That's drwalt.com. And until our next visit, remember the words of the psalmist who wrote, God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. May his and your writing be blessed.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Inside Story, hosted by Walt Larimore. If you have comments about the show or there's an author you'd love to hear from, email Walt at insidestory@liftable.tv.